Morning, everyone. Thank you for taking some time out of your night to join us. My name is Tova Meyer. I'm a senior admissions counselor at Expert Admissions, and I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Dr. Bari Norman, who is the head counselor and co-founder of Expert Admissions, and Sasha DeWind, who's the executive director of Tutor Associates. And we're going to have a great conversation about the latest trends and insights and hot topics in testing and college admissions.
Great. We are going to start, as we usually do, with the poll. We love to see what grade level everybody is in, or who your student, what grade level your student is in. It helps us adjust our responses and our conversation best to our audience. So if you could please let us know the grade you or your student is in, that would be super helpful. And once we have, people are still voting, which is great. Once people are done responding and it slows down a bit, I will share. But it does look like we're just about half 11th graders. It's still moving a little bit, but we're at about 50% 11th graders, about a quarter 10th graders, and then just a mix to 9th, 12th, and other. So definitely about half the audience in 11th grade and a quarter in 10th grade. So thank you for responding. I'm going to close the poll because I think we're pretty much set there. All right.
Great. So our main goal tonight is to discuss recent trends and updates in college admissions and standardized testing. So let's just dive right in. I'll start with you, Bari. What trends did you see in this admission cycle? What are some things that stayed the same? What changed? Did anything surprise you?
Yeah, I actually think, a lot of times, we'll say it's kind of been what we expected, even in the sort of sometimes chaos and certainly the change that has transpired over the last 5-6 years. But I think this year was an interesting year. So a couple of things that I've noticed that have been different or remarkable in some way is that there's certainly been much more waitlist movement prior to May 1. Many schools have already had waitlist movement, and really all over in terms of selectivity, not just including highly selective schools, Ivies, non-Ivies, Ivy Plus, and then, schools at all levels. So that's something that I think is unique to this year, certainly relative to recent years. And I would say also it's been interesting this year. It's been a bit of a mixed bag at the Ivies and Ivy Plus schools in terms of applications and admit rates. You have some of them receiving record number of applications, lowest admit rate. You have others that have had the highest admit rate in 5 years, or in certainly recent years. And some of that is for different reasons. Some of it we can kind of point to certain things, and at some places it's curious and we don't necessarily know. But that's also been something that we've seen. Another thing also on that topic, more schools are not releasing statistics in their announcements of overall kind of admissions. They might give a general sense, we have this many applications and we're up or we're down, but then they stop there and they give nothing. That's a trend that kind of started in the last 5 years or so, but it really was like 1 or 2 schools that were doing that. And we've seen more schools this year pull back on releasing statistics. And then the last thing I would say is just that we know this, but I think it was really underscored this year, is just how much fit matters, at least fit the way that the admissions office defines it and sees it in applicants through their essays, that you can have legacy, you can go to whatever school, you can have great grades, but if the fit isn't there, it's going to be exceedingly difficult to see an admission offer, especially the more selective the school.
And just a quick point of clarification, I think we all use so many abbreviations and so much lingo. Bari, can you just clarify what you mean by Ivy Plus?
Yeah, sure. So there's the Ivy League schools, which the 8 schools in that athletic league. And then people will often say Ivy Plus, meaning places that are kind of equally as difficult, if not harder to get into, but aren't technically in the athletic league. So whether we're talking about Stanford or Duke or MIT or Northwestern or whatever. There's a bunch of them that fall into this category. Small liberal arts college like Williams and Amherst, those are all Ivy plus, if you would. So basically super selective schools, essentially, regardless of size.
Thank you. And just to kind of build off of what you were saying about some of these trends and the importance of fit, I think particularly for people sort of just beginning to clue into the college admissions process maybe a little earlier, and there's so much chatter everywhere we go. There's this sense that it's just more unpredictable than ever, that they're just harder than ever to predict in terms of decisions. Do you have any thoughts? Do you agree, disagree? Any words of reassurance?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is interesting actually, is that on the one hand, our process here in the US is really unique and even easy to say peculiar relative to anywhere else in the world. If you look at any other higher education and admission system, it looks nothing like ours. And this idea of fit is a big piece of it, the holistic review, right? You can't have just a GPA and an SAT or ACT score and really have much clarity at all as to what's possible for you, certainly at any particular school, for the most part. I mean, again, there are going to be some schools, but they don't tend to be the schools that our students will be interested in. And so when you have a range, numbers that help guide you, but then you still have so many schools to kind of figure out where might I actually be able to get in, you need something to be able to lean onto and to kind of look into to say, okay, where does it make sense for me to apply? Where should I strategize for early decision or early action? And how do you do that with, kind of as make an educated decision, not just sort of some shot in the dark, right? And I do think that while it not being about the numbers, it's like the best thing and the worst thing at the same time for students, right? It means that, guess what? It's not all about the numbers. And then also, guess what? It's not all about the numbers. So if you have high GPA, high SAT, doesn't guarantee you anything. That sort of like can be the not so good news. And then the good news is that if you don't have that, or if you have that, like there's also possibilities for you as well. I think with fit, that idea, really getting to know a school and also being self-reflective and honest about yourself and being able to communicate that in your essays and thinking about what other people are going to say about you and their recommendations. If you know the school, you know yourself, and you have a good sense of how others are going to describe you as well, I think you can come together and actually have a pretty high level of predictability for your schools. I mean, we do it all the time, right? We can't know exactly what's going to happen at every school for every kid, but we can come up with a list and know that in this range, at least 2 of these are going to work out. We're not going to know exactly which one all the time, but we can gauge and we can give you a sense it's more likely here, less likely here, even though they might be in the same tier. So I do think that there's a fair amount of a high level of predictability, as long as you're understanding the process, right? Even if you don't agree with the process, if you understand the internal logic of the process, whether you think it makes any good sense or not, it's not too difficult to predict. In a way, again, not 100% at every school for every student, but to do so in a way that you can be strategic and hit high for whatever that might look like for you.
Thank you. And Sasha, I'll turn it over to you. Obviously, another big thing on people's mind is standardized testing, and it seems I've been in this field almost 2 decades, and it seems like something is changing every year. So what are some recent changes, some trends? What updates can you share about specifically the ACT and the SAT?
Sure, yes, this is a year of change, just like all the other ones in those 2 decades. But as Barry said, right, there are things that change and there are things that stay the same. So what is changing is the format of the ACT. That's happening for all intents and purposes in September. Technically, you could opt to have that change in April, or this past April, you could have had that change. It's already May 1st, but it is for all students changing in September for both the paper test and the online test. So we're going to break that down a little bit for you. should you be a junior now and you're going to be taking these tests into the fall, should you be a sophomore just thinking about these things, you will have an option of a paper or an online test. And the test will be a little shorter, a little more generous in terms of timing. The biggest complaint about the ACT is I just don't have enough time per question. They're giving students more time per question. I think those are the most important takeaways, is that it will be a shorter test and it will give students fewer questions and more time to do it, which is a great thing for kids who for whom the ACT makes sense, but the timing has always been particularly difficult. The other big sort of change, although I want to say that this isn't actually a big change, is that the ACT is making the science section optional, just as for many years the writing essay section has been optional. And the reason I want to understate this change is that until Bari tells me it's optional, in other words, until Yale says it's optional, it's not optional. So for my students, for our students at Tutor Associates, you should be taking the ACT with the science section, whether or not it's optional according to the ACT. And though it will not be factored into your composite come September, so your composite is the average of, well, now the 4 sections, English grammar, math, reading, and science. In the fall, yes, the composite will just be of the first 3, English grammar, reading, and math. The science section will certainly be scored and will be sent to schools. And the schools will, as they always do, over time, figure out what that means to them. But the schools are less adaptive than the tests in some ways. They're used to seeing what they see, and they are going to expect to see what they've been seeing for the last 30 years. So in that sense, nothing's changing. And the other thing that I would say is that, as they make this test really more appealing, which is what they're trying to do, right? The SAT has gone digital. The SAT gives you more time per question, and they say, well, don't forget about us. We'll make it a little bit nicer too. I want to remind everyone these tests are curved, both the SAT and ACT. So while, yes, they are giving kids a slightly more generous amount of time per question, they're giving everyone that, right? So in that way, nothing has changed. Your job as a parent is to help your child take on this task of doing very well on either the ACT or the SAT, pick one, and to make sure that they are picking the right test, prepping at the right time, taking the test at the right time, and we'll go into that in more detail. But yes, the ACT is changing, and in other ways, it's the same old test. Even though they would like to emphasize, they're calling the changes enhancements. So you can see it's a real marketing thing more than anything else in my mind.
Yeah, just to chime in, Sasha, is it's some colleges, not that many, have made announcements on this now optional science section, and as to be expected, it's unpredictable regardless of the school type or level of selectivity. It's been all over the place. So your best bet is just to plan to take it. And that way you don't find yourself interested in a school but not having a score that you can possibly submit. Another thing is that on the live questions, somebody asks, is there a preference for SAT or ACT? That's a quick answer, no. Whichever one you prefer, and just do one of them. If you have to switch because you realize, you need to switch with your tutor at some point, that's another story, but focus on one of them and plan to take just one. And the question also, there's one about how will ACT super score if you take both digital and paper? It depends. Different colleges have said different things. That the most, I think, will end up letting you score a super score across, but it will be school by school. And so you'll need to check with every school to see what their policy is.
And we'll talk more about super scoring as we go on. But I did want to note that I also saw a question about the ACT writing. At this point, I'm not sure there's a school I can think of that requires the ACT writing, the ACT essay. There's no essay on the SAT anymore. So that's one that you don't have to do. And it's so funny because there was a period of time where we were saying about the ACT writing what I'm saying about the science. Just take it to be sure. There's different schools had different requirements. And then finally they dropped it. That may happen with the science. It may not. But for now, we're in that moment of take it, be sure, and then you will see what happens. But the ACT writing, no need. ACT science, please do assume you'll be taking that if you go ACT. And that's the big change. The SAT is staying the same in the sense that it's changed a couple of years ago and is going to continue to be online only, an adaptive test with different modules, and your performance on the first module determines which module you get next. And it's going to be continuing in the same format.
Since you teed it right up, why don't we talk a little bit about super scoring? Recent changes to the ACT notwithstanding, super scoring is always a question on people's minds. I think it's a little bit more straightforward with the SAT than with the ACT. But how do you talk a family and a student through making that decision? A lot will, of course, depend on the schools and their policies, but particularly if a student, for example, gets a really high composite score in one sitting of the ACT, but maybe on a different sitting, a certain subtest that they're aiming for was higher. How do you feel about the decision-making process?
And Barry's going to answer most of this, so she'll talk about the reporting as well. But I do want to say that my quick advice is it's case by case. It depends on the kid. It depends on the school. And this is the decision to be made at the end of the process, not the beginning of the process. So the beginning of the process, we're sort of just focused on doing as best we can at the right time. And then once we have all the data, then the decisions get made, and it is case by case. And I've helped many parents look at different ones and figure out what's best. But I'll let Bari speak to the way the ACT and SAT slightly differ on the Common App and what she advises.
Yeah, so on the Common App, which is where most students will spend most of their time application-wise, not necessarily exclusively, but for a lot of people exclusively, they'll be on the Common App. There is a testing section where you have the option to report scores. I would report scores if you're submitting them. Be careful if you have some schools on your list where you're not, others where you are. You want to make sure you submit the one with scores to the right schools and the one without the scores to the ones that you're going to go test optional. But the SAT and ACT are reported differently. So if you're submitting SAT scores, self-reporting SAT scores on the Common App, you are asked for your best, kind of verbal section and your best math section, and you enter those two, and that's it. If you're putting in ACT, they ask you for the best of each section: English, reading, math, science. And then they ask you for your best single composite. So you don't get to super score there, right? They don't ask you on the SAT what was your best total score in one sitting. They do ask the equivalent of that for the ACT. They may still super score depending on the school, but they are going to see that the highest composite score you got in a single sitting was 32, even if your super score is a 34, for instance. So you just have to be mindful of that. Depending on the school, they'll be more or less flexible with individual section scores. So the more selective the school, the less flexible they're going to be. If you're applying into a major, regardless of the level of selectivity of the school, if you're going in as a business major and your math scores are lower, that doesn't make good sense. So you want to think about submitting or applying to that major or whatever. So there's a number of different things that will come into play to determine. And for a single student, you may do one thing at one school and another at another, which is why I mentioned the separate submissions. But there is a real difference between the way it's self-reported. And almost all schools allow self-reporting, not all do. That means that you just report the way I've just mentioned. If you have to send test scores directly from the testing agency during the application process, they'll all require a verification at the end. But at that point, you've already been admitted. It doesn't matter. If they require it during the application process, you can send individual test dates, whether it's SAT or ACT, but you can't pick and choose scores or composites or anything like that. So you're going to either send everything for April or everything for June or nothing for a particular test. So you can't kind of pick and choose how you report directly from the testing agency, except to determine if you want to send a test date or not.
I'll just put in a quick plug that if a school does require scores sent directly from the testing agency, make sure you do that well before the application deadline, because it's not as instantaneous as we think it should be in our digital age, where you think it'll show up at your doorstep tomorrow morning from Amazon, but not true for test scores from the testing agencies. One of the reasons I think we are all talking about standardized testing so much is that it is very much back at the forefront as colleges have reinstituted testing requirements. So this is going to be a question a little bit for both of you. What changes have you seen, or do you anticipate changes to schools' average test scores now that more schools are going back to requiring testing? And for schools that are still test optional, does that mean really test optional, or does it mean you should still send it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, this is our favorite answer. You'll hear it over and over again, right? It depends. What's the school? What's your score relative to where, the top of the range is? I will say as a quick response is test optional? Yes, but ideally, you will be able to give scores at the top of that school's range. And if it's not at the top of that school's range, I would think very carefully about whether or not you should submit. With regard to averages kind of moving, or mid 50% moving now that scores are going to be required, I think yes, but I also think the truth is that before COVID, the scores that were going to be really truly competitive at the more selective schools, it's the same stuff we're looking at now. It's just actually they have no choice but to be in some ways more transparent now. It almost like kind of gives you that it gives you the information that before was a bit more veiled and behind the curtain. And it just feels it's big they're big numbers. It was always the case that you can apply with, but to be, again, a more competitive applicant, we would have told you pre-COVID at the more selective schools that you want to try and break 1550. Now it's just out in the open for you to see, not for the reasons you would think, but so I don't know that the numbers are going to change so drastically. Also, people who were throwing in applications who didn't have the scores and felt like maybe I have a chance because I don't have to give scores, those people now just won't show up in the applicant pool because they know, right? And just like they knew pre-COVID, like I'm done. My scores are just too low no matter what anything else is. That's going to mean that those mid-ranges aren't going to move all that much. So might we see a little bit of movement? Sure, but I wouldn't expect anything so major. Also, the places generally that have gone back, not all of them, but the places that have generally gone back to testing are places that are looking for, relatively high scores. Most places still, as of today, have stayed test optional, and we'll see what happens in the future. But for now, I think you're going to see things stay fairly similar. I wouldn't expect any big change anytime in the immediate future.
And in terms of planning, it's a lot like what we said with the super scoring. Like there's things to decide on the other end of things that we will decide then. But at the outset, especially for our sophomores listening and for our juniors, certainly you too, and even for our 9th grade parents, we should plan to test and do very well. And then someone like Bari can advise on, okay, this score should go to Michigan, but not to Yale or whatever the case is. But the scores may help you in certain places and not in others. They may have to go to a place, they may not. But we want to have those scores in an ideal world. And I think for me, I'm watching more kids. Right at COVID, there was a drop off of the kids who were like, I'm never going to get there. And some of those kids have come back and pushed from some of the not most highly selective schools that do require. I'm seeing them come back and push for those scores, but among the most selective schools, I haven't seen any data that the scores have dropped in any way at all. So, and they were always there. So nothing has changed. Some things change, some things stay the same. That'll be our motto today.
And I just saw a question come in about when schools will determine.
Wouldn't it be nice
to find out more?
Answer to that.
Yes.
Whenever they want.
Whenever they want.
Which is why it goes back to which is why you have to be prepared to give them, because it can change quite late and at an unfair time to students. It can change, and it has changed at certain schools, which is why we advise people to act as if it's required, whether it's the science section, whether it's testing in general, and then where you have the flexibility for the schools that you're applying to, you'll make the decision on whether or not to submit scores, but you won't find yourself in a situation where you can't apply because you don't have the basic requirements.
And Sasha, can you talk a little bit about that preparation process? Obviously, it's going to vary a lot from student to student and their specific, strengths and preferences and needs. But how do students decide between the ACT and SAT? When do you start? Do you need to get up to a certain math level before you take the test? How do you go about really strengthening and improving your scores?
Yeah, I have so much to say about this, of course. We'll start with the when and the sort of basics of the logistics. I do think, and there's differing opinions on when a child should actually take. I think the end of 10th grade or the summer before 11th grade is the time to figure it out. That doesn't mean you have to start now or that you're too late if you haven't already done it, but sometime in 10th grade between January and sort of July when everyone goes away, I'd like kids to come in for a full SAT and a full ACT. Some schools host these at the school, so they don't even need to come in and do it with me. They've done it at home or they've done it at school. And yeah, the best way to do it is the full length of each, unless there's some compelling reason why we're just trying one. And a child should try it with the accommodations that they have. We can talk about accommodations at more length, and that gives you the what, right? So maybe you're starting at a 1200 on the SAT and a 27 composite on the ACT. That's the what. Okay. Then there's the why. And the why really interests me quite a bit. There are some whys that are harder to fix than other whys, right? So sometimes it's, oh, I took the ACT after not sleeping, and the SAT I was well rested. Oh, okay, good information. Sometimes it's just timing, but I knew if I had the time, I would have aced it. That's also important information for me. Sometimes it is, I haven't yet learned that math, but I'm learning it right now in 10th grade, and we'll get to what content you need. And sometimes it's, I thought I did great, and then I seem to have gotten most of the SAT stuff wrong. And I'm like, oh, yes, that happens a lot in the SAT. So the why, you need to try the diagnostics, and then you need to really dig in with an expert on the why, because the why, I'm more afraid of certain whys than other whys. Certain things are really easy to fix, certain things are harder. By the end of 10th grade, most of our students have taken Algebra 2 Trig, Geometry, and Algebra. Most of them take pre-calculus in 11th grade. That may not be the case for your child. They may be in a different track than that. In general, you're set by the end of 10th grade math from a content perspective. And on the other 3 sections, no one knows their grammar, and we love teaching it. There's the same 14 rules over and over again, so don't worry about that content. And reading and science are really skill-based. They're not content-based, so it's about reading. And if you're doing the ACT, interpreting graphs. It's not about content knowledge. So really, by the end of 10th grade, the large majority of our kids are set from a content perspective. And then the question is, well, how do you, move from a 28 to a 34 on the ACT? How do you move from the 1200 to the 1550? And in some ways it is like taking another class in school, right? It takes a lot of time, it takes commitment. And what I love about it is that it is like learning a foreign language. And why I say I love that is because your children can learn a foreign language. They really can. They can become fluent. They shouldn't be fluent as 10th graders. They should be fluent by the fall of 12th grade. And they do have a lot of time to become fluent. And I was a kid who didn't think I was good at standardized tests, and then I learned how to do it. And I was like, oh, I'm not bad at standardized tests. I needed to learn how to become fluent. And I really like that language with our children because it really expresses their capacity to do something that maybe they feel they're inadequate at because they just haven't been taught they haven't been taught the language. So how do you teach a child the language? It's one part content. Yeah, you have to know your Algebra 2 and your trig and your geometry, and you have to know how to read at a certain level, and you need to know where a comma goes in a very precise way, not just sounding it out. You got to know your commas and your verbs and all that stuff. Yes, but that piece is actually just the very beginning of fluency. And frankly, our kids tend to come to us pretty fluent in their content. Yeah, there are holes here and there, and none of my kids really know where commas go. But the content is pretty fluent. They read at pretty high levels at these top schools. and they're incredibly capable young people. The second piece of becoming fluent is the mastery of the patterns and the procedures. Okay, I know where a comma goes. So every time I see a comma question, I have to have a procedure. Every time I see a variable in the answer choice, I need another procedure. So it's about turning the test into a set of patterns that are easily recognizable so that children can navigate the traps, navigate the pitfalls, the difficulties, and express the content that they know effectively. And then the final piece, and the piece that comes a little bit later in the process, is a little bit like, in terms of the fluency metaphor, it's a little bit like giving an oral presentation at the end of becoming fluent. It's a performance. And if you are sick, if you are fatigued, if you are anxious, which I would say 100% of the kids I work with are anxious about this, right? And it's a high stakes feeling for them, understandably, and they're still pretty young. If they are distracted by the annoying kid tapping his pencil, those things have a huge impact on our ability to execute that comma with that pattern, that procedure. And so those three pieces all need to be put together over time, with the child in mind. You know, there are concrete things that help us manage, not get rid of, but manage our anxiety while we test. There are concrete ways to manage fatigue. I will give kids chocolate covered espresso beans. I'm not above it. I'm not. But there are real things that we can do to enhance that performance, because so many times kids know category 1 and category 2 and category 3 has not been, they had given the attention that's due. So that's what goes into fluency. And I want to just reiterate that your children's schools are doing so much of the work in category 1, but none of the work in category 2 and 3. And that's where, an amazing and inspirational and caring tutor, who customizes things around your child comes in, right? To work on those 2 categories. And then I know there'll be questions about when to test. This is, again, very child dependent. There are kids who have sports schedules or go to boarding schools or summers away or summers where all they're doing is this. Every kid has a different set of sort of parameters I'm considering when we set official test dates. There are kids who finish early. That's the fall of junior year. That's early. There are kids who finish in the spring of junior year. That's quite typical, although spring of junior year is a incredibly stressful time. And I'm always like, stay away from May and June of junior year. You're going to be so tired. Please focus on your finals. And then I would say most kids, frankly, get their perfectly, goal score the fall of their senior year. So no rush, but each kid is different in terms of the timing. So.
Thank you. I really like that metaphor, the foreign language and the performance metaphor. I think it's a really helpful framing. So, we always talk about kind of that one, 3 hours where you're likely feeling some anxiety as one piece of it, but there's also this much longer term, very big, important piece of what you are doing throughout your 3.5 years of high school leading up to your application. So Bari, can you talk about the other big factors? I think one of the questions that we received for this, and that I always received as an admission officer, I always receive now as a counselor, what really stands out most? What's most important to college admission officers when they are selecting those candidates, and your recommendations within that?
Yeah. So the answer, I think, will be a little bit frustrating for people, because a lot of people want like a prescription, like do this, and then you can get this or something at this level, let's say. There isn't, no surprise, there is not like an exact formula. However, there are absolutely broader and more specific things that you should be thinking of to increase your chances. And just keep in mind that it is school dependent. So what might be great for a certain set of schools might be a little less compelling for other sets. But generally speaking, so academics are king in the sense that should be the first priority. If you can't find yourself, academically viable in an applicant pool, the rest of all the other stuff doesn't matter. So you want to be able to kind of pass that initial academic review. That means, yes, doing well in your classes. It also means challenging yourself rigor-wise with regard to courses based on what your school offers. So don't worry about what your friend takes at another school, whether it's public or private or down the street or in another state. All you can be kind of measured against is what is offered at your school, because that's the only thing you have access to. In an ideal world, you're challenging yourself across the core academic subjects: English, history, math, science, and foreign language, regardless of what your individual interests are. That's not always going to be possible, and then you're going to make some decisions accordingly. But in an ideal world, you're challenging yourself across the curriculum and you're doing well in all of your core classes. Again, what does well mean depends on the school, but as well as you can do. Once I sort of say that, that's like door number one. So you make it past door number one, now it's door number two and door number three. You know, the first thing is most important, because without it, like I said before, nothing matters. But decisions are really made on the softer factors, because that's where, for the people who made it through that initial academic review, now everybody is there. And usually, by the way, it's about 80 to 85% of applicants will be academically qualified. So the vast majority are making it through door number one. Now they've got to pick amongst all these qualified applicants. How do they do that? Each school does it a little bit differently, but it's absolutely going to kind of come from your own academic interests and your extracurricular and co-curricular involvements. There's no magic formula: do this and not this, do that, don't do that. It really comes down to what are your interests? How can you best pursue them? What are you going to be able to do with each thing? How connected do you feel to what you may or may not do? And how can you communicate that through essays? The essays are pretty much the only time you get to speak. It's certainly the most important time you'll get to speak. If you are applying to one of the few schools where interviews are actually evaluative, sure, that's part of it, but it's a teeny tiny number. Sometimes there's going to be a glimpse video or some kind of video. That's another piece of data, but really learning about you and who you are and how you might fit into the class is going to come from your essays and then from what other people say about you, and it should all come together. And so, you know, you've got the academics, you've got extracurriculars, and again, I don't care really what you're doing. I care how you're doing it, why you're doing it, what you get out of it, what you've put into it, how it translates to other parts of your life. I care about all the other things except for the what in many ways. And the what is going to come from your authentic interests. Doesn't mean it has to be your life's work or your passion or even anything that you'll continue after you start college. It's for now. And for now, this interests you. Might it interest you later? Yes. Might it not? No. Who cares? Just focus on now. I always say, you know, it's kind of like you can think of it as a long short-term project or a short long-term project, but it really is for a relatively short period of time. I think the open-endedness of the extracurricular piece, and so many of the essays will dig back into how you spent your time outside of school. More so, you'll find yourself writing more about yourself outside of the classroom than inside. You'll definitely write about your academic interests, but most essays, if you look at all the supplemental essays you're going to be writing, most of them will not be focusing on what you find intellectually stimulating. So you really want to think carefully about how you spend that time and what you're getting out of it and how you're bringing yourself to it. And then it's your job to communicate it in the essays when the time comes, and you're going to communicate some things a little bit differently depending on what each school prioritizes in their review process. Some places might want to see kids who are doing something more creatively. Some want to see people who are doing something more interdisciplinary. Some schools are going to want to see kind of these real doers and sort of extroverts. Others don't care at all about that. So you're going to kind of think about the different aspects of you in each of the things that you do, and then determine for each school what and how you're going to write about it. But you know, and academically, you have to live in a pretty narrow space, regardless of your academic interests. Extracurricularly, I love that we really can truly, authentically follow students' interests, really, like without worrying this is better than that. Whereas we think about that a lot when we pick courses and think about course selection. But that for some people can feel overwhelming because you have such a big open-ended extracurricular sort of piece that you have to bring down into a little funnel that should be like this narrow by the time you get to senior year, but you've got years to get there is the good news, and you get to let your interests guide you. And so I like the fact that we have so much freedom and flexibility with the extracurriculars, but it can feel overwhelming at first, but with good advice and good guidance, like you can come up with great stuff, very cool stuff.
And that's where that fit comes into play that we were talking about before, tailoring
Exactly.
it to schools.
Exactly. And colleges, by the way, Tova, to give you a single word answer, what do they want? Authenticity, right?
100%.
Yes, you've got to think about the game more largely, you know, like the process, but they get so much stuff that just sounds good, but it doesn't really tell me anything. I always say it says everything and nothing at the same time. They get so much of that when you actually get a student, an essay, an application that feels like a real person and that you feel like is really connecting with you, that's what's going to make you stand out, not what you chose to do after school on Wednesdays.
And it's so easy to tell for admission officers what's authentic and what's not.
There's just too many applicants, you know, the numbers are too big for it to kind of slide through. It's much easier to get away with stuff like that all the time with your school papers and the way that you write academically and for class assignments. It's really, really hard when it gets personal.
Let's dig in a little bit more to what you were talking about of the academics and the challenging yourself. And you know, we always get lots of questions about, should I take this class or this class? Do colleges want to see, do the top colleges want to see students taking 4 years throughout? We get a lot of questions about particularly foreign language. Is it okay to drop the foreign language? You said that it really, you know, you want to be challenging yourself across those subjects, regardless of what you want to study. But in addition to that, are there specific things that students should be thinking of if they're interested in a very popular or increasingly competitive major? I'm thinking specifically engineering, business, computer science, things like that.
Yeah, great question. So ideally you take 4 years in English, history, math, science, foreign language. That will not be possible for everybody for a variety of reasons. The place that you can most easily get away with 3 years is going to be foreign language. And if you're going to drop the 4th year of foreign language, you should replace it with something else substantive, you know, something an academic elective that is kind of core-ish or core adjacent, if possible. Now, at some schools, you know, it might be a little bit more typical that not all seniors take history. Now, just because something is true at your high school doesn't mean that colleges change their standards and what they want and what they expect. And so just remember that no matter what high school you go to, how well it's regarded, colleges do what they want to do, and they don't flex to little high schools anywhere, no matter what it is. So try to use the colleges as your sort of North Star and thinking about, like, what am I trying to go for? As opposed to thinking about what do some people in my high school do. But that said, if it's, you know, if students who are attending the tier of schools that you want to attend are not taking history, and you sit down with your school counselor and that's clear across the board, then you might have some flexibility. But generally speaking, I would say foreign language is really the place where you can potentially get rid of that 4th year if it really is going to be painful. And for some kids, it certainly is. With regard to the other part of the question, Tova, it's just escaped me. It was
majors that are really competitive.
Yeah. So computer science is probably the most popular and most competitive major across campuses. There are many admissions deans and directors who have shared with us they could fill the whole class with computer science majors based on qualified applicants who apply. They can't and they won't, but they can. And so if you're looking at computer science, like Tova said, engineering and business are also very typically going to be sort of more competitive. At some schools, communication will fall into that as well. But generally speaking, those are the ones I think that are the most obvious, like kind of the usual suspects. If you are applying to those majors, and you know that you want to make sure that you're in as a first year and you're going to have access to those programs no matter what, because some schools allow that Other schools you can't access till later and you apply later. Some, if you don't apply out of high school, you can't touch them the whole time you're there. It's all over the place. So figure out how important it is to you to be in a devoted undergraduate program in these areas. And if it is important to you and you are going to declare yourself a business applicant or major, a computer science applicant or major, any of these, business, any of these ones that we're talking about, engineering, you must demonstrate that you have had experiences, substantive and more than one, in this area. That is what has shown you that you want to take this, relatively narrow pre-professional path starting right out of high school. So you can't go in and just sort of say, I'm interested in business. Either I've been around it my whole life, or I want to make, a lot of money and this is a good route for it. Even though people say that privately with us, that's fine. But you're not going to say it on your application.
Put that on your application.
Exactly. But, I've been around business, a lot. I find it fascinating. I loved my econ class and I thought this was really interesting and I noticed this. That's all fine and good, but that's not going to compel them to give you one of the precious slots. It's a good reason why you're interested in business, but it's not a good reason why they should select you and pick you. And so you must have direct and clear experience in these areas. That very well and oftentimes will mean within your course selection, but it might not. It might reside completely outside of what you're taking in class, in school, class-wise, and may be very much about co-curricular or extracurricular activities. But don't apply to a pre-professional or narrowly focused program just out of interest or fascination. You've got to be able to show that you've done it, you know what it is, you know why you want to do it, you're qualified to make a contribution, and you still have more to learn.
I think that's an area where summer experiences can really come into play. You have any quick advice about how to think about those summer experiences, how to seek out ones that will be meaningful or helpful to students in doing those things that you talked about?
Yeah, I think, very generically, I would say classes tend to be a bit more helpful the younger you are. The older you get, doing a class is less helpful. Again, every situation is unique, but I'm giving generic advice here. Things should get increasingly, hands-on and applied. And things should also kind of get increasingly, I would say, interdisciplinary across your interests as you get older. And as you get a better idea as to maybe where you might want to apply early, if you're applying early somewhere, or where your top few schools are, that's when, especially when you're planning your senior summer, where you might want to make some special tweaks and maybe point yourself in certain directions with those particular schools in mind. But that's nothing you need to know as you're building and making your way towards senior year.
And I should just jump in. This is not about college applications per se, but summers are a very important time to get a lot of that ACT, SAT work out of the way. School is exhausting and hard. If we can build those scores early. And the other thing I'll say is, I have a 10-year-old and I do this with her, but summer is a time to fill holes that are, or build capacity in preparation for the school year. If that means repetition of math concepts or filling a concept that was weak, if that means previewing a particularly difficult thing, if that means working on writing skills, you, especially heading into 9th grade, though certainly heading into 10th, 11th, and 12th, you want your child hitting the ground running. You want them starting at that place where they already feel confident and like they're thriving. So I also just wanted to sort of plug that, because I do it with my own kids. I mean, my kindergartner is just reading, but I do it with my own kids. And I think it's an important moment where you're setting them up for success in September.
And also make sure you schedule actual downtime where you do nothing, because part of summer is about regenerating and, gearing up for the next year. And so we never want to have a student, scheduled from the day they end, the academic year in the spring and the first day of, of school in the fall. And even if you have to actually schedule the downtime, schedule it. I don't care. And don't do too much in a summer. Sometimes people they want to do 4 different things. And if you're doing 4 different things, none of them are particularly substantive. You're not getting what you're going to ultimately need out of it. So don't overthink it and overdo it either.
Great advice. For all of us, I think. Sometimes we need to schedule that downtime regardless of our age. Bari, we've touched on it in a few responses tonight, but I'm hoping you can talk specifically about early decision, trends you've seen, how students should think about that, and a word that we use a lot is strategy. But what are you seeing lately in early decision this past year and looking ahead to next year with what you can, your crystal ball shows you so far?
Yeah, so we saw also a little bit of kind of ups and downs in ED applications at some schools, but nothing like where there's a very clear title, shift or whatever. And so I think things in that regard are pretty steady. It is still the case, I don't foresee it changing, that early decision will always be your best chance at getting into that particular school. It doesn't mean that it's always a wise choice, because, the bar to get in could be here, and with early decision, you make it to here, and without early decision, you'd be here. It's a waste if it's only going to bump you up to here and you're not going to clear, the bar. So I think you still want to absolutely be strategic about where you're choosing. And keep in mind what it means when we say that your best chance is in early. It doesn't mean that it's an entirely different process with a whole different set of rules and, kind of general expectations, but it absolutely will be your best shot. Early action, the one that's not binding, that can differ from school to school, like how big the tug is and how big the kind of sort of the weight is of it. It will depend if early decision also exists at that school. If there's 1 or 2 rounds of early decision plus early action, it will depend even on the particular school. So early action, there's a little bit more kind of variability in what it means strategically, whereas early decision will always be your best shot. But again, that doesn't mean that you just pick your favorite school regardless of what your chances might be for your early decision option. And so I think otherwise like I said, trend wise, there was some places that kind of saw a bit of a surge, and some places that were down a bit, but it wasn't so many schools with the ups and downs, at least so far as we've heard. Statistics and rates are still trickling out.
We have we're coming up on the end of our webinar, but we've talked about standardized testing. Of course, we've talked about, broadly speaking, the transcript, this course selection, how you can really set your students up for success. Sasha, with some of the things you mentioned over the summer, and we talked a little bit about essays. But Bari, can you just kind of close us out tonight with your thoughts on trends in essay topics? And I know we always tell our students, wait until August 1st because they change. But what trends have you seen, and what advice do you have to offer students at any stage of this process as they prepare for those essays when that time comes in August 1st of their about to be senior year?
Yeah, so August 1st is when the supplemental essays will be released. Many will be released August 1, but not all. So don't be surprised if a school you're interested in, when you go into the Common App and their supplement isn't ready on August 1st, it may happen. The main essay, they've already announced that the prompts are the same. We don't even have our students read the prompts. I think it's a better strategy not to read them. There's a topic of your choice. There's a very generic first question that any essay topic almost will fit into. So nobody's looking at what essay question you're responding to. They're just reading your essay. But for these August 1 supplements, which is what's going to take months to get through, are all the supplements. It's not the main essay that's going to take all your time. It's the supplements that are the time suck, and the ones that are going to be most of the time sort of looked at most closely to determine if you're a fit for a particular place or not. These are the essay questions that schools determine on their own what they want. So they all have to agree, okay, we're all going to take these main essay prompts. But then with my school, I get to choose what I want to ask on our supplement. And so they care a lot, and they've thought very carefully about what they're asking, and there are reasons why they're asking or not asking certain things. We tend to see questions about community, identity, collaboration, impact, intellectual interests, a lot of different things. And again, almost all of it stuff that will touch on time spent outside of the moments you're in actual class. Almost everybody will write an academic interest essay, as we call it. Sometimes it's fairly straightforward in the sense that those can be hard to write, make them not boring. But they can be fairly straightforward, kind of just what are your interests, why, where do they come from, how do you plan to pursue them? Other ones ask with very particular language about things that excite you intellectually, something that's really piqued your interest, something that you've taken farther independently. Again, it's going to depend on the school, but the most important thing is to really read the language very carefully. You are going to see questions, especially when you're on school number 5 or 6 or 10 or 12, and you're going to say, oh, this is a community essay. I have a community essay from Michigan. I'm going to use that. And then if you look carefully, yes, it's a community essay, but they are getting at something a bit different than Michigan was getting at. And so don't be tempted. Don't take the bait and kind of just recycle an essay because it sort of fits. A lot of times, by the way, it doesn't fit at all. Yes, they're both community essays, but students will do this. They'll submit a first draft and it's sort of like a slightly adjusted version of another, let's say, community essay. And it's like so off, even though they're both community. It's like, this isn't at all what this question is about. In fact, if you really read it. So just read things carefully, take the time, surrender to the fact that it's going to take a long time to get through all of them, and learn about each of the schools and have a sense of who they are and what they tend to respond to. Because you may have the experience, you just have to know what part to tap into, or maybe what parts to focus on, or how to best present to school A versus school B. But keep it as a methodical, organized process. I do not recommend working on them all at once. Do school by school, get your solid community essay written for school 1. Then in the next one, maybe you're going to write an impact essay, whatever. Get the good solid versions of those, and then you can adapt, not just adjust, but really adapt it. The parts where you might be talking about yourself or certain things that either you did or got out of something, those won't change. You'll be able to copy and paste a little bit, but not as much as you're going to want to do. And sometimes you're going to be able to keep that first version next to you, and then kind of as you're starting from scratch for a different school, start pulling in when it makes sense. It can take so much longer to take an existing essay and try to rework it for somewhere. It becomes a big jumbled mess, and it takes so much longer. So starting from scratch, even for a similar essay, is actually often a good idea.
Thank you. So we are at 7 o'clock, and I apologize, I feel like we're never able to get to all of the questions, but if you do have additional questions, Bari and Sasha are going to put their email addresses in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out. We'll also be sending out a recording of this webinar if you'd like to go back and watch it with all of your friends and family over the weekend. We'd love that. And just want to thank everyone for taking this time to share your questions, and especially thanking Bari and Sasha for their expertise. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Tova. This was great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Have a good night.